Good morning and welcome back to HAC's virtual annual convention program for Wednesday, November 24th. Welcome back. I'm just going to take a few minutes here again to thank our corporate sponsors and our virtual partners for jumping on board. We really can't thank them enough for their support, not just for our virtual event, but also for their ongoing support for HAC. Wanted to start by saying thank you to our corporate sponsors, and I'd like to read them out by name: Airbus Helicopters Canada, Airworks New Zealand, Bell Textron Canada, BMG, Gallagher, Leonardo Helicopters, Safran Helicopter Engines Canada, Standard Aero, and Willis Towers Watson. So thank you all to our corporate sponsors. Our 2021 virtual partners. First of all, our platinum partners: Airbus Helicopters, Bell Textron Canada Limited, NAV Canada, RMCI Inc. Our gold partners: Emond Harnden LLC, and our supporting partners: Helitrades, Onboard Systems International, and Parker Lord and Reed Services. So thank you all for your support. We couldn't do it without you. Yesterday, we heard from Stephen Williams, who made a presentation on the pay equity laws and how they will impact many in our industry. We also had a great round of committee meetings that garnered interest and discussion on several key areas of interest. Flight training chaired by Kathy Press, and their guest speaker, Serge Cote from Transport Canada. Safety and Quality Committee chaired by Corey Taylor. Had Bill Yearwood made a presentation as well, and Todd Cash chaired the meeting for our popular Air Taxi and Aerial Work Committee. So thank you to all of you who presented yesterday. Of course, we also held our 26th annual general meeting as well for HAC. Again, as with yesterday, I'm going to walk through a few basic housekeeping rules for the proceedings today. Please participate in our program using the Q&A function while our surveys are underway. All of our sessions today will seek your participation, and the chair or moderator, along with our tech producers, will help facilitate questions and comments to the best of our abilities. A unique feature will be used by the TSB Town Hall, incorporating the use of the Slido app to answer questions and surveys, and they will be asking during their session. Download information can be found in our virtual lobby and in the session chat. Additional instructions will be provided as they launch the session. We will also get to meet the new president and CEO for HAC. I'll be having a conversation with Trevor Mitchell following the TSB Town Hall. But to get us started today, we'll be hearing from TSB board member Paul Dittman. He's been good enough to offer to provide an overview of several recent TSB helicopter occurrence investigations. The presentation will recap key findings and identify some common themes to consider for improving the safety of helicopter operations. And a very brief introduction to Paul. Paul began his career in aviation with the Royal Canadian Air Cadets, earning his glider wings in '85. After joining the Canadian Armed Forces in '86, he completed pilot training in '91 and then went on to fly the Sea King helicopter on operations with 423, 443, and 814 Royal Navy squadrons. He later instructed on the Sea King with 406 Squadron and on the Outlaw helicopter with 3 Canadian Forces Flying Training School while serving as its commandant. Paul has 4,000 hours of flying time and is qualified as a naval diving officer. Paul's experience at Naval Defense Headquarters includes posts as an aircraft accident investigator, as the chief investigator for the Canadian Armed Forces. Additionally, he held the posts of contracted flying training and support program manager, director of air simulation and training, and director of fighter capability requirements. Paul is a graduate of the Royal Roads Military College, a Bachelor of Science, Physics and Oceanography, Royal Military College, Masters of Defense Studies, Canadian Forces College, Joint Command and Staff Program, and NATO Defense College. It's a senior course in Strategic Defense and Security Studies. He retired from the Canadian Armed Forces in 2017, and Paul has been with us presenting for a few conventions and we're delighted to have him back. So Paul, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Fred. Thanks for that warm welcome. And g'day, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to join the Helicopter Association of Canada's annual meeting for this time. Of course, it's in the virtual forum. It's good to be speaking with everybody here. I'm not sure how many participants we have on the other end of the camera, but I'm glad that the TSB has been once again invited to this venue. It was 2019, I think, the last time we presented in person. So hopefully next time we will be once again in person. Bear with me for a moment. I will share my screen with you with this presentation, and then we will get going. Okay, so you should be seeing the title page now of our presentation. I have about 45 minutes with you this morning, and I'm going to present 4 helicopter investigations, a summary rather, of each of these 4. And I find that I've selected these 4 in an effort to provide you with a wide range of operations that cover a good portion of your industry. So there's a little bit of something for everyone joining us here today. So with that, let's begin. So for those of you who are new to HAC and maybe perhaps to the TSB, I'll just spend one slide just to give you a quick high-level overview of the TSB. Then I'm going to talk about the highlights from 3 recent investigation reports. I'll leave you with perhaps a thought on a common theme that I see within those 3, and link that to other, a theme that we see in several of our reports as they are put through the process. I want to spend a little bit more time in depth with a specific case study. It's an offshore operator out on the East Coast before leaving you with the final thought for the day. So to start, the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, of course, our mandates to advance transportation safety in not only the air, but also the marine, pipeline, and rail modes by first and foremost conducting independent investigations. Those investigations enable the board to identify safety deficiencies, causes, and contributing factors. And in certain occasions, then we can make recommendations to address the systemic issues that have been identified. And of course, as you're familiar with, we report publicly on our investigations and findings. Nick Robinson presented yesterday. He represented Transport Canada. And in that context, I'd just like to highlight that the TSB is not the regulator. That falls to Transport Canada for the air, marine, and rail modes. And lastly, but most important, or also importantly, it's not the function of the board to assign fault or determine civil or criminal liability. So those are the big ticket items when it comes to the TSB. So we're going to start with this first of the 3 little overviews that I'm going to present. But before I dive into the highlight of these 3 investigations, I would like to mention that there are many more interesting details, issues, and findings in these reports than I have time to present to you today. And so I'd like to make the point that you can access all these reports and more on the TSB's websites. And before we conclude, I'll throw up a slide that shows you all of our social media contacts and ways to get in touch with us. So the context for this first investigation, it takes us to a flight training scenario to the 19th of November in 2018. The aircraft itself was a Eurocopter EC-120B. The student was also the helicopter owner. He had about 100 hours on the aircraft in total time, with 7 hours solo. The instructor was a Class 2 instructor-rated pilot with a commercial background who had been an independent freelance instructor since 2009. He had about 5,700 hours total, of which 3,000 were instructional. So here we come to the mission. It was a day VFR student solo training flight in Quebec from Rouyn-Noranda to the Mirabel Helico Airport, which is also near Mirabel International Airport just on the outskirts of Montreal. So the total distance of this trip was 250 miles, nautical miles, through the lower Laurentian Mountains. And upon arrival at Mirabel, the plan was that the instructor would join the student for the return flight back to Rouyn-Noranda. The weather, general conditions along the planned route were forecast to be ceilings of 800 feet AGL with visibility of 3 statute miles and moderate mixed icing in some areas between the surface and 4,000. The Mirabel TAF, just to situate you, this is in the area of the destination, was few at 600, broken 1,500 with 6 statute miles. With respect to aids to navigation, I'd just like to mention that the helicopter had on board a fixed GPS as well as a portable GPS. They're both Garmin units. And the GPS data that we recovered from these 2 units was used to reconstruct the flight path that you see on your screen right now. And I'd also like to point out that the student was not very familiar with the operations of either. And during the flight, the intention was for the student to use a hand-free cell phone for communications with his flight instructor, who was to supervise the flight from his location in the vicinity of Montreal. So as far as the occurrence itself, on the 19th of November in 2018, the student instructor briefed the flight and weather by phone at 0700. And once at the hangar at 0900, the student then asked the licensed pilot who he'd found in one of the on site to program his GPS unit for him. He then spoke twice more with the instructor regarding the weather before eventually taking off at 10:22 from Rouyn-Noranda for Mirabel. And at around the time of takeoff, the instructor also obtained updated weather information that indicated that icing was present along the flight path and that instrument meteorological conditions were expected to remain around Mirabel. So all in all, not a good weather picture for a long distance solo student cross country. En route, the student called his instructor twice to report that the flight was proceeding well and to update his ETA for around 12:50 that afternoon. And during the flight, the student didn't obtain any weather updates or ask for any weather updates during the flight. By 13:20, and unable to establish communications with the student, and because the helicopter had not yet arrived, the instructor then contacted the Joint Rescue Coordination Center in Trenton, Ontario, to report that the helicopter was overdue. And there, at that point, had been no ELT signal detected, nor was there ever one detected. And the following day, around 16:04, the helicopter was found. So in this slide, we have a closer look at the final stage of the flight. This area is near Mont Tremblant, as you can tell by the imagery, is heavily wooded. You can't necessarily see the relief, but it is a mountainous region. And you can see how the helicopter maneuvered and how its height above the ground changed in the final moments before colliding with the side of a hill. Here on the picture on the left is, you'll see the crash site as it was found. And you can see the helicopter sustained substantial damage as a result of the impact, and there was no post-impact fire evident. Sadly, the student pilot was fatally injured during the crash sequence. And what you see on the right is a photo of the undamaged ELT as it was found at the crash site with the switch in the off position. And I just make a comment that, as we see not infrequently in many of the aviation occurrences that are investigated, the Canadian Beacon Registry had not been updated after the owner had acquired the helicopter earlier in 2018. And of course, that issue hampers search and rescue efforts in the event of an accident or some sort of occurrence. So we move on to the key findings from this investigation, which it was a class 3 or a detailed investigation of medium complexity. The first one we have is that the solo training flight was authorized despite weather conditions below the minima stipulated in the flight training program, and there was a possibility of freezing drizzle. So the lowest weather at the time of the pre-flight briefing was forecast for 800 AGL and 3 miles viz with moderate mixed icing. And you'll want to know that the flight training company's weather minima for cross-country training flights were 2005. So the second one, supervision of the solo flight was inadequate as it did not include obtaining updates on weather conditions. And the background to this is that just prior to the student's departure, the instructor contacted the Quebec Flight Information Center to obtain revised weather information along the route. At that time, he was informed that conditions near the intended destination were IMC and that no change was anticipated throughout the day. Additionally, the Mirabel TAF was revised twice during the planned flight, indicating conditions as low as 600 overcast and 5 miles in mist, but the instructor didn't monitor this changing weather. And during the 2 phone calls with his student in flight, the instructor discussed neither the continuing poor conditions in the Montreal area nor alternate flight planning considerations. And the report goes on to further discuss the supervisory aspects of this flight. And our third finding that I'll present to you is that it's highly likely that the student pilot encountered unfavorable weather conditions that forced him to fly at a very low altitude to maintain visual reference. And with respect to the GPS data I had mentioned before, the data showed a nonlinear track over the ground. Investigators believed that these minor deviations were likely to avoid weather in the mountainous area. And additionally, the data showed a reduction of airspeed and a gradual decrease in height above the ground, both of which are consistent with the pilot focusing outside and ahead of the aircraft while trying to avoid weather. And lastly, investigators found a thin layer of ice on one of the main rotor blades at the crash site, which suggested the presence of freezing precipitation during the flight. And if you go on back to the report, which you'll find on the TSB's website, you'll be able to read about several deficiencies with the student pilot's training plan, as well as Transport Canada's oversight of freelance flight instructors. So this brings us to our second occurrence report. So this takes us to the 20th of July of last year in 2020, when there were 2 privately registered Robinson R-44s on a multi-leg cross-country flight. They departed Springdale Airport in Newfoundland, and the pilots planned to refuel at an aircraft maintenance facility located on the northeast side of Thorburn Lake, also in Newfoundland, and that's what you see on your screen. Upon arrival at Thorburn Lake, the first helicopter overflew the landing site, which was a gravel parking lot surrounded by trees. The pilot determined that it was an unsuitable site due to its size and wind conditions, and informed the occurrence pilot of his intention to land elsewhere. The occurrence pilot then conducted an approach to the landing site and entered an out-of-ground effect hover just below the treetops. And once established in the hover, he determined that there was not enough room to continue with the landing, and so he initiated a vertical climb. And on screen, you can see the estimated flight path derived from the helicopter's GPS data. And when the helicopter cleared the tops of the trees, it began to slowly yaw to the right. The pilot applied left pedal to counter the yaw, but this had no effect, and the yaw rate increased. The pilot then deflected the pedals left and right several times, but this was also ineffective. And as he was trying to control the yaw, alternating nose up and nose down pitch excursions began with increasing amplitude, after which the helicopter made at least 2 full rotations to the right. The main rotor then severed the tail boom as the pitch excursions increased beyond a controllable range. All control was lost and the helicopter collided with the terrain. The pilot and passenger sustained multiple serious injuries, and that passenger was seated in the right front seat, whereas the passenger in the right rear seat was fatally injured. Witnesses close by then provided first aid to the occupants and extinguished a small fire that had occurred. and the helicopter was destroyed. So this was a Class 4 investigation, meaning that it was a limited scope fact-gathering investigation to advance transportation safety through greater awareness of potential safety issues. So not quite as complex an investigation as the first one I presented to you. Before we get to the safety message, I'd just like to say that, as most of you already know, landing and taking off in a confined area is an advanced maneuver that presents unique challenges and requires a detailed and methodical process to first assess the confined area before conducting practice and final approaches. In this case, the occurrence pilot, who had about 150 hours total, was familiar with the landing site. Although he had driven the vehicle by the landing site many times, he had never landed the helicopter there. The pilot also knew that other large helicopters, such as a Bell 206 or an A-Star 350, had landed at the site in the past. However, as this occurrence demonstrates, a cursory evaluation of landing site is insufficient to identify hazards and can lead to poor decision-making that can ultimately result in fatal consequences. So, of course, our first safety message is that all helicopter pilots, no matter how experienced, need to conduct a detailed and methodical evaluation of a confined area to assess the factors that could affect the approach, hover, or landing and departure. So in the lead up to our second safety message, I'm sure many of you will also be familiar with the Federal Aviation Administration's wind envelope for main rotor disc vortex interference with the tail rotor, which is the diagram on the left, and the wind envelope for tail rotor vortex ring state, which is the diagram on the right. Of course, winds in the red arcs can cause an unanticipated right yaw or loss of tail rotor effectiveness, LTE, as is often referred to, in single rotor helicopters. So Robinson Helicopters addresses this in its safety notice number 42, which is entitled Unanticipated Yaw. And in it, I'll paraphrase with what Robinson states, which is that Robinson helicopters are unlikely to experience LTE due to their tail rotor blade design that provides more authority than many other helicopters. However, the safety notice does state that a failure to apply proper pedal inputs in response to strong or gusty wind during a hover or slow speed flight may result in unanticipated yaw. And this safety notice forms part of the R-44's pilot operating handbook, but the notice was not found in the occurrence operating handbook. So ultimately, we don't know if the occurrence pilot was aware of this information. We weren't able to figure out if he had been exposed to it during his training. But regardless of whether this was a case of LTE, as Robinson states, unanticipated yaw, we know that unanticipated yaw can pose a significant threat during flight at low speeds and in high power regimes, and when a helicopter is operated within certain critical wind azimuth regions. But we do know at the time of the occurrence, the helicopter was approximately 130 pounds below maximum gross weight. It was operating in a high power regime, and it was in and out of ground effect hover. We know also that the winds were estimated to be gusting up to 20 knots. They were turbulent and approaching the helicopter from the left or from the critical wind azimuth regions shown in the diagram. And therefore, we get to our second safety message, which is it's important for helicopter pilots to recognize the factors that may induce unanticipated yaw that, if not corrected, can result in a loss of helicopter control. So this is the third occurrence I'd like to speak about. This takes us back to the 17th of August of last year, 2020. And on that day, just before 0700, the pilot of a Eurocopter A-Star 350, it was a B2 model, operated by Aberdeen Helicopters, started his flying in support of a mineral exploration project approximately 45 nautical miles northwest of Stewart, British Columbia. By 0800 that morning, he had already transferred some crew between a base camp and a drilling area when he began to longline drill rig equipment between pad 27 and pad 7 that you see on your screen, pad 27, pad 7, and there were approximately 1,400 feet in between those two pads on what is known to be called Nickel Mountain. Between 0800 and 1022 that morning, the pilot continued long lining equipment from pad 27 and refueling twice down in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen at the staging area. At some point during this time, the visibility, which had degraded due to cloud and rain, forced the pilot to temporarily remain in the hover until it improved. At 1022, the pilot then returned to pad 27 to pick up the final piece of the drill rig. However, after liftoff, he was unable to depart due to incoming weather, which was quite poor. And so we set the load back down. And after the load was disconnected, the pilot then departed for the staging area, presumably to wait out the weather, but we didn't know that for sure. At this time, heavy rain began and the drill rig crew at pad 27 took shelter. And after about 15 minutes then, the drill crew emerged, and along with the crew at pad 7, they attempted to reestablish communication with the pilot. However, efforts were unsuccessful, and so a ground and then later an air search began. And later that day at about 14:30 in the afternoon, the helicopter was found approximately 1,200 meters west of pad 27, as you can see on the left side of the screen. And you can see, obviously, you get an idea of the topography of that area in the mountain on Nickel Mountain. And as we get closer, we'll take a picture. You can see how we've annotated the approximate flight path just prior to the impact, the estimated location of the initial impact, and where the main wreckage was eventually found after it was consumed by a post-impact fire. And the elevation here is approximately 5,500 feet. The pilot, who had about 2,800 hours total time and was in his second season of flying to support exploration in the area, was fatally injured. So this was also a Class 4 investigation, limited in scope and mostly just fact gathering. We do know that the accident occurred in a mountainous region directly affected by moist coastal air and known for its rapidly changing weather conditions. At the time of the accident, the temperature was approximately 12 degrees C with 100% relative humidity and light to moderate rainfall. We know that the VFR flight in reduced visibility conditions, whether those conditions are caused by precipitation or obscuring phenomena, is hazardous, particularly in a mountainous area. And so that brings us to our message, is that in areas where weather changes rapidly, it's important that pilots and air operators establish operational limits and procedures to maintain visual contact with terrain at all times. So as I did in this presentation, a similar presentation in 2019 during the HAC convention, I'd like to draw out a common theme that I see in these three reports, but as I go through this, please don't take this as me telling the helicopter industry how to suck eggs. Rather, this theme in these three reports is also reflected in what the TSB often sees in many other reports. And so I think it's worthwhile to point out and draw your attention to. And that is, it's quite simple, really. It's that you need to know your limits. We need to know our limits. We need to know our weather limits. What's the weather now? What will it be later? And what are those minimum requirements that I or we need to have to operate in those conditions? We need to know what our operational limits are. What are the procedures, limitations, and restrictions established by your company and the aircraft manufacturer that will affect your mission? And then lastly, we need to know what our personal limits are. Do I and do my crew does my crew have the qualifications, the experience, and the currency to get the mission done safely? So I know that these are three things that I ask myself once we've done the mission brief, before we launch, before we walk out on the flight line, just to cover off the basics. Okay, so we're getting into the fourth of the 4 occurrence reports that I'd like to present to you. We'll be able to now take a bit of a deeper dive into this one. This takes us back to the 24th of July in 2019 with the Canadian helicopters offshore Sikorsky S-92A that departed from Halifax International Airport on a 155-mile IFR flight to the Thibodaux offshore platform complex southwest of Sable Island. And you can see Sable Island and the platform complex. And I know I've been out to Sable Island and to many of the rigs in the region. The weather can change quickly. We've got the duty fog bank that often exists off the East Coast, and it can move. Fog can move very quickly, so that those changing conditions are definitely a hazard to consider. Even in VFR operations. Okay, of course, you've got the S-92 on the left here, and I'll show you a picture of the Thibodaux complex facility. We can see that we have 3 platforms. We have a small platform in the foreground, accommodations, administration on the left, and then we've got our helideck and the business end of the complex on the right. So on board the S-92 were 2 pilots and 11 passengers. And upon arrival at the platform, 2 instrument approaches were attempted. However, landing was not possible due to low clouds and poor visibility and fog. During the second missed approach, the flight crew acquired visual contact with the platform, which at 174 feet above the water was visible above the fog layer. They then elected to carry out a visual approach and maneuvered to roll out on final 0.6 of a nautical mile from the platform at about 500 feet and 60 knots. And then they maintained their altitude and airspeed to their final approach gate or window at 0.4 of a nautical mile when the manual approach was begun. And just for frame of reference, the company's SOP is for a 4.7 degree glide slope, but the occurrence crew were using a slightly steeper angle. And I also like to point out the photo on the left of the complex, which was obviously taken in VMC. You can see the approximate orientation of the platform after the helicopter rolled out on final during the visual approach. So that's sort of the sight picture that they would have been expecting to see towards the end. So as the helicopter descended, the pilots entered a low visibility condition with no visible horizon, and their visual cues on the approach began to degrade. And then several things began to happen very quickly. The helicopter's attitude progressively increased to a maximum of 17 degrees nose up. The airspeed bled off, and the rate of descent increased significantly, peaking at about 1,800 feet per minute. So to help you visualize what I just described, on scene, you can see the flight profile reconstruction based on the occurrence data that we were able to recover. And to orient you, the platform is in the foreground, just off your screen, denoted by this red star. You can see that they started their approach around 500 feet, around 60 knots. And as they progressed from 0.4 of a nautical mile, beginning their descent, of course, you can see that their altitude, or sorry, their height above the surface is starting to decrease. Rate of descent is starting to increase as we carry on. You can see the attitude changes that are starting to occur: 979 feet per minute, 1,783 feet per minute, maximum rate of descent. And then I'll describe a little bit more of what happened lower down here as you walk your way through the diagram. Through about 70 feet, the collective was raised to arrest the descent. and then engine torque increased to 146%. Additionally, the main rotor RPM or NR decreased to 77%. Tail rotor authority decayed, and the helicopter began to yaw rapidly to the right, peaking at more than 60 degrees per second. As a result of the main generators dropping offline due to the low NR, the automatic flight control system, or AFCS, reverted to stability augmentation system mode. The attitude and heading reference system dropped offline. The center and left cockpit multifunction displays went blank, and both pilots reverted to using the standby flight instruments. After passing through the fog layer, but while still descending, the NR began to recover and the generators came back online. And then the pilots were able to ultimately arrest the descent. And during the 55 seconds it took them to regain control of the helicopter, it had rotated through 845 degrees, and the estimated minimum height over the water was 13 feet, but the TSB's engineering laboratory assessed that 13 feet was an upper bound and the actual height may have been lower. During the subsequent hand-flown overshoot and climb to altitude, a second inadvertent descent occurred, but the situation was rectified in a timely manner. The helicopter then returned to the Halifax airport without further incident, and there were no injuries. So to demonstrate the role of visual cues in the offshore environment, the TSB used visual modeling software and the occurrence data to create representations of how the visual environment might have appeared to the pilot flying, who was seated in the left seat of the cockpit. The frame of reference here takes you to the beginning of the visual approach at a distance of 0.4 of a nautical mile at 490 feet on the Radalt. So you can see on the left, the image demonstrates clear conditions. And image on the right shows a degraded visual environment, or I'll refer to it as a DVE, similar to that of the occurrence. There are some points that are worth mentioning about the representation on the right. The first is that the red star here indicates the aim point of the rough aim point of where the approach was to terminate, just to the right of the helideck. You can see that the helideck is above the water's surface. However, it is obscured at that point, the water's surface is obscured. Depth perception, of course, is deteriorated. As you can see, the fog layer, there is no discernible horizon. And then, of course, as you descend through that layer, your visual cueing will become even more degraded as you enter into the fog layer. So this was a Class 2 investigation. It was complex, it was long, and required a very high level of effort. And I just point out that the report does make 18 different findings. So I've paraphrased the key ones for the purposes of today's discussion. So you get the main points. I'll start with saying that the investigation found that the IMC created a degraded visual environment, or DVE, that was conducive to spatial disorientation. Due to their past experiences and familiarity with one another, the pilots attempted a non-standard visual approach without considering the risks and other options. And during this maneuver, the helicopter developed a low airspeed, a high rate of descent, and a nose-up attitude with a low power setting, creating a low energy state that went undetected by both pilots, both of whom were focused on the helideck that was sitting above the fog and in an area without a discernible horizon. The DVE made it, of course, difficult for them to recognize the unstable approach. So contributing to their difficulties, the SOPs in place at Canadian Helicopters Offshore, or I'll refer to them as CHO. Though the SOPs in place at CHO made no reference to energy state in its stabilized approach criteria, increasing the risk of a low energy state developing and going undetected. Additionally, CHO had not adopted the recommended practice of requiring crews to check and verbally confirm that the approach was stable at specific gates on final approach. As a result, The SOPs in place at CHO provided flight crews with insufficient guidance to ensure that approaches were being conducted in accordance with industry recommended stabilized approach guidelines. The investigation also determined that while on final approach in the DVE, the pilot flying depressed and held the cyclic trim release. As seen in other occurrences, this technique reduces the overall effectiveness of the AFCS, automatic flight control system. And in this occurrence, the helicopter reached a nose-up attitude of 17 degrees, which also resulted in an excessive rate of descent and an increasing left side slip while on final. Flying the visual approach in a DVE while depressing and holding the cyclic trim release switch increased the pilot's workload. It also created a situation of attentional narrowing that led to a breakdown in their instrument cross-check. And it also contributed to control difficulties that resulted in the unstable approach. So as the helicopter descended below 250 feet, it was in a steep 800 foot per minute descent at a very low airspeed with power being applied. Spatially disoriented, the pilot flying instinctively raised the collective, and the helicopter's rate of descent rapidly increased to about 1,800 feet per minute. The application of power while in the steep, low airspeed, high rate of descent condition caused the helicopter to enter vortex ring state. So neither the manufacturer's flight manual nor the operator's SOPs warned of the potential hazards associated with the use of the trim release switch under conditions such as in a DVE. If manufacturers' flight manuals and companies' SOPs do not include guidelines for the use of the cyclic trim release switch, it could lead to aircraft control problems in a DVE due to the suboptimal use of the AFCS. The helicopter inadvertently descended with a very high rate of descent into the fog bank at low airspeed with the landing gear extended. And despite this, the helicopter's enhanced ground proximity warning system, or EGPWS, did not alert the pilots to this situation. And this is a result of a gap previously identified by the TSB in the S92's EGPWS. If an inadvertent descent occurs with the gear down at airspeeds below 50 knots indicated, the EGPWS will provide no warning against controlled flight into terrain. And in 2016, the TSB issued recommendation A1610, which called for terrain awareness and warning systems for commercial helicopters that operate at night or in IMC. These systems are still not required by regulation. And as a result, helicopter manufacturers and operators that are free to disable GPWS modes, which we did see here on the S92A. This brings us to a risk finding. Until EGPWS and helicopter terrain awareness and warning systems become mandatory for Canadian commercial helicopters that operate at night or in IMC, flight crews and passengers aboard these flights are at increased risk of controlled flight into terrain. So to touch on some of the safety action taken, as a result of this occurrence, CHO took several safety actions, most noteworthy of which are on the screen. They developed a DVE approach procedure for inclusion in company SOPs. And they developed also a flight training package that consisted of these 3 points: additional CRM training to address the DVE, cockpit gradient, and decision-making. Training to include simulator ground school, including power management and the new DVE approach procedure, and also a simulator session on the new DVE approach procedure. So this brings us to the end of my discussion on this Class 2 investigation, and I'll leave you with one final thought. And that is that this was a very scary occurrence. And let me tell you why. I know the aircraft captain very well and for a very long time. And in fact, we used to fly together many years back. And as a result of that relationship, I had recused myself from the review or anything to do with the investigation process and the review of the report And so once it was, the investigation was complete, that's only then when I was able to, like you, see the report on the website and understand, read it and understand what had gone on. So yeah, as I said, I knew the AC very well. We used to fly together. When I was a flight instructor, the AC was the standards pilot for all the standards pilots in our large organization. And still now, as back then, I have the utmost respect for his professional piloting skills. But this is where my fear comes in. As we saw in this occurrence, he was part of an experienced crew that had almost 15,000 hours total time together. They had the best of intentions to complete the mission, and yet the AC and his co-pilot almost lost their aircraft and their 11 passengers. So why am I scared? I'm scared because of this aircraft captain with all his experience and knowledge, and as somebody I respect so much, can find himself in a situation that went from routine to near disaster in the blink of an eye. If it can happen to him, I know it could happen to me, and that's what scares me. And so I share this with you because in the context of whatever your own operation is, I believe that whatever the it in your context of your operation or company is, I believe that the it could also happen to any one of you. So I leave you with this thought that when you get home and are back on the flight line or in the office with your colleagues, I challenge you to take a moment and ask yourselves, what can I do to prevent the it from happening in my operation? So find whatever that it is that is familiar to your context, and what can you do to make it, prevent it from happening. So that's the presentation for on recent helicopter investigations of interest for HAC 2021. There are many different ways you can contact us, the TSB, and failing any one of these, either through HAC, we're also reachable. And with that, I put the last slide up for any questions, comments, discussions. And so I will attempt to go to the chat function here. Okay, so we do have a bit of time still. I don't see any screens or any questions coming in. And Q&A. Okay. So the question is, am I able to comment on the Bell 212 accident at Evansburg, Alberta on June 28th, identified as TSB investigation, and the investigation numbers there? And the direct answer is no. During an investigation that's ongoing, apart from the information that is shared on the TSB website, providing the investigation update, there's nothing additional that's posted there. The investigation update on the website, you will find a short summary of the investigation occurrence details, and whatever other communications have been deemed appropriate to make at that point in time of the investigation. And that's as much as information as possible. All right, so I see that there are no further questions. We will then move to a brief pause. Barbara and Fred will then guide everybody attending to the next session, which will be the TSB's watch list survey to obtain feedback. And if there are any other questions that come up, they can be posed on the conclusion of that session. So thank you very much, and fly safe and be safe. Thank you.